In this lesson, I asked the question, what is peer review? And also asked the question, and why should I care? The objectives are to understand the peer review process, understand the pros and cons of that process, and then finally understand why this is important in our climate negotiation work. So I actually went back to basics and took a look at what Merriam-Webster dictionary said about peer review. It's a word we throw around a lot in climate negotiation, and I just wanted to get some clarity as to what it actually means in terms of the process and its application. So Merriam-Webster said, it's a process by which something proposed, as for research or publication, is evaluated by a group of experts in the appropriate field. And there's some key words in this definition that we need to pay attention to. Evaluation by appropriate experts and prior to publication. So it's a process by which we evaluate work before it becomes public, and it's evaluated by people with similar expertise. It's a form of self-regulation. It's evaluation of work by one or more people with similar competencies. So it requires qualified members of the profession to take a look at it. And it's a way ultimately to maintain quality, improve performance, and provide credibility. So the whole idea behind peer review is to ensure that the quality of the work that's presented is good. But it's not one process. There are actually different kinds of peer review that we encounter in our work in climate change. There's firstly professional peer review, and that focuses on the actual day-to-day performance of the professionals themselves, improving quality, upholding standards, or providing certification. And it's usually based on a code of ethics, and this is something that would be familiar to folks with a professional engineering designation or a lawyer or perhaps an accountant, those sorts of people who have to adhere to some sort of professional code. Then there's scholarly, which is the one that people bandy around the most in our climate negotiation work. And it's subjecting an author's scholarly work, research, or ideas to the scrutiny of experts in the same field prior to publication. And finally, there's technical peer review, which involves a well-documented review process for finding and fixing defects, typically in design work or in engineering practice. And it's conducted by a team of peers, and it's done prior to finalizing the design or key technical decisions in technical work. In climate negotiation, professional peer review comes across as maintaining our ethical standards. It's usually complaint-driven, and it can result in loss of license. So basically, it's a system by which we evaluate the performance of professionals themselves and their adherence to a professional code of ethics. In scholarly work, it's designed to maintain quality and the integrity of the published work. It can be very rigorous, and something that is often not understood outside of academia is that it can become very heated. People do have disagreements at this stage, and they have to come to a consensus or some form of agreement before a document can ultimately be published. And in technical, we ensure the quality of the work that we're doing in terms of addressing climate change. And failure to follow a technical review process can result in professional peer review. So, in essence, technical can lead to professional peer review if it's not done correctly. And it's a day-to-day activity, and it results in iterations and revisions in design work or engineering practice. Well, there are pros and cons of this process. The pros, in terms of peer review, is that new ideas have to survive the process, and it demands rigorous substantiation, and it is fact-driven, and it's intended to promote quality and integrity of the work. And ultimately, one of its biggest benefits is that it's understood and accepted within the various professional communities that apply it. But there are some inherent issues with peer review. The first one that's often cited by climate skeptics is institutional bias. That is, presenting ideas that just fly in the face of current orthodoxy in the practice. So that's something we have to be aware of. And because of it, new ideas can be difficult to publish. And as a result, the profession can be seen as a closed shop. The other thing that we've seen, and this often happens in peer-reviewed papers that skeptics will present, unfortunately, is that the experts that have done the peer review may actually not be experts in that field. So oftentimes they may have cherry-picked an expert who agrees with the idea, but this person, although they have, say, an advanced academic qualifications, have never done any real work in this area. And as a result, errors can slip through. And one of the biggest drawbacks of peer review is that it's a process that's just not easily understood outside of the professional communities that use it. But, overall, despite its flaws, it is a good process. It's not perfect, and we need to use it with caution. And we need to understand the possible bias of publications and reviewers. So that's something that we need to apply in our application of the process. But the alternatives are significantly worse. And in fact, most skeptics offer nothing substantive in its place. Perhaps a blog with a bias, or ill-informed advocates, or trolls. And I like to think of it like democracy, and I turn to Winston Churchill's quote about democracy, which is one of his most famous. And he said, "Many forms of government have been tried and will be tried in this world of sin and woe. No one pretends that democracy is perfect or all-wise. Indeed, it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time." And that's sort of the way I look at peer review. Despite its flaws, it's the best we've got. Now, I'm going to take a bit of an aside for a few moments here. One of the favorite examples that climate skeptics point to when they talk about the inadequacies of peer review process is the story of Galileo. Now, what they point to is the misconception that the majority of scientists in his day opposed his heliocentric theories, and that he was the lone voice that was in opposition to the mainstream of scientific theory. And as it turns out, that's not true. What actually happened is Galileo's peers agreed with his theories. It was the church that saw his theories as heretical, and they prosecuted him for heresy. And in the end, he was lucky not to be put to death. His peers cautioned him. They said, just keep quiet about this, because you're going to get into a whole heap of trouble. Otherwise, they just stood in the background and kept quiet, because they didn't want to share his punishment. You understand that he was a notable figure in the day, and the church, while it would be reticent about punishing Galileo, would not be so reticent about punishing his peers. So they stood back and watched. And what did he do? Well, actually he underwent 2 trials for heresy. In the first, he agreed not to publish scientific work on the heliocentric theory. So he agreed to that, and first trial's over. But then he discovered a loophole in his agreement. He said, "I would not publish scientific work on heliocentric theory." So instead, he wrote a story and he published it. It's called The Dialogues. Unfortunately, in that story, he created a character who resembled the Pope, and that character was actually quite ridiculous within the dialogues. So, at the behest of the Pope, he underwent a second trial for heresy. And in that case, he was found vehemently suspect of heresy. In other words, not quite a heretic, but almost. It was the worst the church could do at that time to him without actually putting him to death. So he was sentenced to house arrest for the remainder of his life. Now, my take on this is that this doesn't make a case for a lonely voice facing fierce opposition from peers who's finally proven right. It's actually the story of a stubborn cuss speaking truth to power. And ironically, that's more like Greta Thunberg than a climate skeptic. Now, in climate negotiation, peer-reviewed science shows that climate change is real. There's about 3% of the papers that disagree, but they've undergone a detailed study of those 3% of the papers, and they have a significant series of technical and reviewer flaws, including cherry-picking data, inappropriate peer review process, and ultimately even just using incorrect data. So I will include in the notes below a link to some very good papers on that very topic so you can see for yourself. The skeptics, on the other hand, argue that global warming flies in the face of accepted orthodoxies. In other words, it's inconvenient, it defies common sense, and it doesn't jive with our day-to-day observations of weather. So we've got two groups facing each other off. And so the sides are drawn up. And that's the challenge in our climate negotiation. We have two sides, one based on facts and peer review, one based on opinion and beliefs, and they're both dug in. So the negotiation overall has stalled. Our job? To negotiate to overcome the impasse. That's our job. In this lesson, I covered the peer review process, talked about its pros and cons, how it works, why it doesn't work. I took a short aside and reflected on the story of Galileo. And then finally, I took a look at why this is important in climate negotiation. Please feel free to comment on the peer review process in the comment section below. We'll review it and share it with the other participants of the course and carry on with the discussion that way.